Liz Barnes, who just got tenured and promoted this week.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Gail says I can take the time to write a book now, so. All right, so thank you all so much for having me. This has just been awesome seeing all of your talks, and I was really honored to be invited. I'm excited to talk about a lot of my research and a little bit about my own path as an atheist, coming to promote harmony between religion and evolution. So this is the Barnes Social Perceptions of Science lab. I'm the PI, and in that lab, we study topics that are really important in biology, but that are controversial in society. And I do this because I want to reduce conflict about these topics so we can improve people's ability to evaluate scientific evidence accurately. And because these topics are controversial, I'm also really interested in the way that we communicate about them and the way that we teach our students in our research labs and in our classes how to communicate them to broader society. And one of the core philosophies that drive everything I do is to try to be as inclusive as possible of as many underrepresented identities in science as I can. One, because it aligns with my own experience as a non-traditional student in academia, but also it turns out that it's really important for helping the relationship between science and society. So we study these topics that we call culturally controversial science topics. So when we have broad scientific consensus about a claim, and yet we have persistent public disagreement. Now, I want to take a second to ask just what you think causes rejection of scientifically valid information. We've talked a lot about quite a few things, but I want you to just take a second because as a biology education researcher, I know that you're going to be much more likely to remember my talk today if I make you active while you're doing it. So I'm going to have you take a second to just think on your own about one idea of why you think people reject scientifically valid information. All right, and now I'm going to have you share that idea with just a few words with your neighbor. All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm sure you all could talk about this for much longer. And I heard some good ideas, right? And there are a lot of things that influence rejection of the idea that humans are causing climate change, or vaccines are safe and effective, or whether humans evolved from prior species, right? But one thing that scientists who study controversial topics talk about is accuracy-oriented versus identity-protective cognition. So as science instructors, we often expect and want our students to be accuracy-oriented, right? So that is, as they're learning about a topic that has claims that are well-supported, we expect that they're going to increase their understanding in proportion to their acceptance of that claim, right? And this is not dependent on somebody's social group identity. And this is what we see with topics that aren't controversial, like photosynthesis, for instance. But when we look at topics that are controversial, we see a different pattern. So that one group of individuals may have a higher understanding of that topic, but it doesn't seem to impact their acceptance, right? This is what we see, for instance, with climate change, with political affiliation sometimes as well. Now, evolution is a topic that biology education researchers think about a lot that's controversial because it's the foundation of biology, right? It's a great historical case study for very strong scientific evidence being consistently rejected in society. I mean, that's part of the reason that we're here today, right? To talk about Scope's monkey trial. And over the last 40 years in public polls, we've seen that consistently about half of the United States doesn't think that humans evolved from prior species. We started to see that go up in 2017. We got really excited. Starting to go down again, maybe because of an increase in identity protective cognition due to the polarization of science, right? But this isn't just among the American public, so it's also among our incoming introductory biology students. So some research that we've done has shown that about 35% of biology students across the nation don't think that life shares a common ancestor. So what factors predict this? And we've already heard a lot about the different factors that predict evolution acceptance. I'll just briefly go over the ones that have been studied the most. right? So first is the context of evolution. We've heard over and over again that it's really human evolution and the common ancestry of life that students and the public have a problem with. Things like microevolutionary principles like antibiotic resistance are almost readily accepted by almost everybody. But also it is understanding of evolution, and although there's some studies in the literature that show no relationship and some overall, we see that on average, if students understand evolution more, they will accept it. But it's also based on religious affiliation, right? So these are some data from undergraduate biology students on their human evolution acceptance. Anything below a 3 is kind of an average of disagreement, right? And when we look at where there's disagreement about this, it's almost exclusively among Muslim and Christian populations, right? But we even see variation in there, right? We see a lot of people that are above the 3 in that agree range. And it also matters how religious the student is, right? So the more a Christian or Muslim student sees religion as important to their identity, the more that's going to predict their evolution acceptance. And what's really complicated about this is those first 2 variables, those first 2 predictors, are moderated by these second ones, right? So it matters the intersection of both religious affiliation, religiosity, as well as the context of evolution and understanding of evolution. And our research lab was actually the first to show patterns of identity protective cognition about evolution among our undergraduate students, right? So these are some data that we collected, and what you see is among the most religious students, right? It doesn't matter if they score 100% on our evolution understanding measure or 0%, they're equally likely to accept the common ancestry of life. And this led us to start to measure a new variable that before this hadn't been measured in the literature previously. And that was perceived conflict specifically between religion and evolution. So we've seen some stuff on religion and science conflict, but we specifically made a measure that gauged perceived conflict between religion and evolution. We put it in a model with all of these variables, and what we found is that that variable far predicted evolution acceptance much more than any of those variables that we put in the model. So what is causing this perceived conflict? So I want to be really clear that conflict can and does exist between religion and evolution, but as many people have talked about, it doesn't have to, right? So there are evolutionary tenets that are absolutely in conflict with things like a literal interpretation of Genesis, right, or the age of the earth. But also, we've talked about how there can be metaphorical interpretations of biblical texts that allow for individuals to both accept evolution and have some kind of role of God in that. And we also often talk about this bounded nature of science, right? That evolution and science is not necessarily atheistic, that it's actually agnostic. We don't say either way. Science is not equipped with the tools to have a test to test whether or not God exists, right? Okay, so now I'm going to share a little bit about my own journey with science and religion. It's going to be a little bit different than some of the ones that you've heard so far today. So I had a really unique path compared to most other academics. I was a child of a child. So my mother was a 17-year-old single mom. And although she was spiritual, she taught me to be very skeptical of organized religion. And although she was really talented in music and art, she unfortunately struggled with drug addiction and mental illness. And because of that, it was so bad, I left home at 15 years old, dropped out of high school, and got a full-time job at Denny's so I could pay rent, right? And I struggled. I was alone for a long time, and I struggled to find community until I, in a few years into that, enrolled in a community college, and I found my love for science. Right? So science was something, a framework that helped me make sense of the world in a way that it didn't make sense growing up in chaos, right? And as an atheist, I fit in with science, right? The people around me were also mostly atheists. I had finally found a place where I fit in. And I specifically fell in love with evolutionary biology, right? And I used to watch evolutionary biology lectures at night for fun. And yeah, and the people that I looked up to the most in these were also stringent atheists. And in addition to being deeply inspired by them, I also became enculturated to see my identity as a scientist and an atheist as one in the same. And I decided that I was going to fix rejection of evolution in the United States. And the way that these individuals talked led me to believe that the way I was going to do that was to convince people that they should choose science over religion. But then I studied history and philosophy of science, and I remember the first time a professor ever told me that science can't prove whether or not God exists. I was almost offended, right? It almost threatened my identity as a biologist. The cultural messages I received led me to believe that science and atheism were one and the same. I was even surprised when I learned that one of the staunchest defenders in history of evolution, Thomas Henry Huxley, was the one that coined the term agnostic to describe exactly what science was. So I've remained an atheist, but the way that I've approached trying to increase evolution acceptance based on these experiences has changed. So, I want you to make a prediction because I thought to myself, maybe my experience as a non-religious student thinking that you had to be an atheist to be a scientist or accept evolution was not unique, right? So we ended up surveying college biology students across the nation and asking them what they thought. And so I want you to make a prediction and just think to yourself, what % of college biology students do you think that they have to be an atheist in order to accept evolution or reject a belief in God? Yes, so incoming, before they've learned anything, right? What %? And you can shout out percentages if you want. What do you think?
50. 1 to 10. 70.
Wow, so we got all the way from 10 to I think maybe it was like 80 or 70, so all over the place, right? Well, 57%, right? So more than half of students are reporting that evolution is necessarily atheistic. And interestingly, there were no differences in this rate between religious and non-religious students. However, the consequences were very different, right? So this graph shows student religiosity from low to high and evolution acceptance from low to high, broken down by whether students had an atheistic perception or not. And students who were the least religious, it didn't matter what their perception was. They accepted evolution 100%, right? But when we look at the most religious students, the students who have an atheistic perception accepted evolution a lot less than those that did. So, my experience as an undergraduate was far from unique. It turned out that many students held this misconception, but for me as an atheist, it actually affirmed my identity as a scientist. But for religious students, not so much, and it may even harm their acceptance of evolution. And I took several biology courses where I saw over and over again professors consistently pitting religion and evolution against one another, and not once did they ever talk about the potential compatibility between these things. And there was even one really formative experience I had where on the first day of a biology and society class, a professor who was a very stringent atheist made a pretty offensive joke about creationists and Christians. And it was after class that I heard two deflated students who said, you know, I'm a Christian, and I don't think that I can continue taking this class. And unfortunately, I never saw those students again. Right? So these were really important for me, thinking about how to increase acceptance of evolution. And I started to wonder whether instructors thought this too, based on my experiences. And I did a couple of interview studies in the beginning that indicated that at least some of them did, but how many? Well, I just collected these data nationwide, actually. And so now I want you to guess, what about biology instructors? What % of them think that a student must reject God or a belief in God to fully accept evolution? 10%, 57, 15, 70, okay, yeah, 54%. Right. So take a look at the room around you. There's probably some of you that have experienced this from instructors, right? So you've seen this graph a couple times already, right? I got really fascinated with this super interesting sociocultural context where you have mostly religious biologists, right? Evolutionary biologists are probably like the least religious group ever polled in history. But you have this context where you have mostly non-religious biologists teaching mostly religious students about a topic in which their perceived conflict religion is going to be the biggest factor influencing whether they accept evolution. And those interview studies that I mentioned, evolution instructors admitted that they would treat evolution and religion as an adversary when they were teaching. But then we also interviewed religious students to ask them about their experiences in the classroom, and they said that they were very well aware of instructors' negative attitudes and that this presented a barrier to their learning evolution. So, as part of my PhD, I scoured the literature and I looked for any kind of practice that I could find that there was some kind of efficacy for that could help religious students reconcile religious faith with evolution. I put them all together and I called it religious cultural competence in evolution. So this idea that we can be culturally competent with religious audiences and help them reconcile. And all of these practices really emphasize potential compatibility between religion and evolution. So we've heard about religious scientist role models, right? So we can show examples of people who hold both deep religion and are scientists, right? We've heard of Francis Collins. Joseph Graves was the first African American to earn his PhD in evolutionary biology, also openly religious, right? Which is important because we have a vast underrepresentation of African Americans in evolutionary biology, maybe partly because of the high religiosity in that population. Right? We also can talk about the different kinds of questions that science and religion can answer. And I agree with Katie 100% that these two things intersect in all sorts of ways. But what I disagree with slightly is that I think what Stephen Jay Gould was saying is that we can have different questions in these areas. So science answering questions about the natural world using natural phenomenon, while using philosophy and religion to discuss things like the purpose of life or the existence of God. Now, that's why I have this arrow here, to show that they can inform one another, right? We make decisions about what science we do based on how we ought to live, right? So these things intersect with each other, but if the questions don't overlap, then there doesn't have to be conflict. We can also talk about the variation that exists in people's views on religion and evolution, right? So a lot of students come in the classroom thinking that either you're a special creationist who rejects evolution, or you're an atheist who accepts evolution. But the reality is there's all sorts of views in the middle there in which people reconcile these two things, and you can talk about them. And also, just avoiding unnecessary religion negativity. So jokes about religion that you don't need to teach evolution, right? Negative comments about religious people that you don't need to teach evolution, right? And then finally, not making students feeling like you're forcing their views or your views on them, right? So recognizing that they have autonomy ultimately over what they're going to accept when they leave the classroom. All right, so we put this together, and then we started doing exploratory studies in single classes, and quite a few of my studies, as well as other people's studies, some that are here in the room, showed in these single classes that this framework could be effective at increasing acceptance of evolution and reducing perceived conflict. But at this point, we needed more controlled studies. We really couldn't determine that it was this thing that was leading to these outcomes unless we started to isolate this effect. So we ran one of the biggest evolution education studies ever conducted across more than 7,000 students. It was a naturalistic quasi-experimental design. So all that means is naturalistic is that we didn't administer an intervention. What we did is we gave students a pre-survey for their evolution acceptance, and then we just let evolution instructors across 71 courses just teach the way they usually do. Right? So we just use the natural variation in instructor practices to then see if it would be associated with students' post-survey responses, right? So their evolution acceptance we measured again. We also collected their religious affiliation, and we asked them, to what extent did the instructor show compatibility between religion and evolution, right? And what we found is that when religious Christian students specifically perceived that the instructor showed compatibility, they accepted human evolution more after instruction than the ones who did not perceive that the instructor did that, right? So this was a really powerful indication that those single studies that we were doing were on the right track. But we had a lot of variation in instructor implementation of these practices, right? So we really still needed some more controlled studies to control for that implementation. But also, remember, 75% of biologists are not religious, right? And a lot of us in our biology community see that as kind of a good thing for us to be able to fit in and to be open about our background, unlike in the US public where atheists and non-religious people are stigmatized, right? So can we be openly non-religious but still be religiously culturally competent, right? So we also wanted to test that. So this time we ran a randomized controlled study to test cultural competence. So instead of the instructor actually implementing the lessons, the students completed a video homework assignment that they were told was going to prepare them for their upcoming evolution instruction. And before they watched the video, they got a pre-survey where we measured their perceived conflict between religion and evolution. We also measured their perceived compatibility. Turns out those are not two ends of one line. They're two separate things. And all students got an introduction about evolution with facts. But what students didn't know is that they were separated into one of three conditions. So the first condition, we had an instructor-actor implement cultural competence and reveal themselves as non-religious. And in a second condition, we had the instructor-actor reveal themselves as Christian, but also implement those culturally competent practices that I showed you before. And then we had a third condition in which students did not receive any cultural competence instruction. And after that, all the students were filtered back into a part of the video that presented them the evidence for evolution, and they received a post-survey measuring their perceived conflict and compatibility again. All right, so now I'm going to show you some results from this. So now what you're seeing is just the control condition compared to the two cultural competence conditions put together. So we're just testing whether not doing it and doing it works, right? What you see here is a distribution of scores before the intervention, right? So students, that black line is the average. So before the intervention, they were perceiving about neutral conflict, right? And now I'm going to show you what it looked like after the cultural competence intervention. Right, so we saw that students who received the cultural competence condition reduced their perceived conflict, whereas the students that did not and just learned the facts and evidence for evolution did not change, right? But what about perceived compatibility? We saw the exact same thing, just in the opposite direction, right? So students were increasing their perceived compatibility between religion and evolution compared to the control. And these were a large effect size and a moderate effect size. All right, but what about instructor identity, right? So we confirmed with our randomized control that the cultural competence is working. Does it matter about the instructor? So we had a non-religious instructor-actor and a religious instructor-actor, same person, just revealing a different identity. But remember, we also have different student identities, right? So we have religious students as well as non-religious students. So I'm going to have you be active one more time, right, and make a prediction. Which identity pair do you think was the most effective for reducing perceived conflict? That's what we thought, right? So we predicted that the religious instructor, based on social identity alignment, was going to lead to better outcomes. All right, so now what you're going to see is the two cultural competence conditions compared to one another, broken down by student religious identity. And the first thing I'll show you is the religious students. You'll see one line for the Christian instructor and one for the non-religious. We saw no difference, right? So, and when we looked at non-religious students, we also saw no difference, right? So in this case, you could be a non-religious instructor or a Christian instructor, be open about it, still be effective with your students. However, we did see one unexpected result. So the non-religious instructor was more effective at increasing perceived compatibility with atheist students. So there was a social identity alignment, just not with the identity that we thought it would be. And we thought this was really interesting and actually pretty important. And I'll tell you why. So what you're seeing here is the results after the intervention. And what it looks like is atheist students actually perceive more compatibility than students from other affiliations, right? But as other speakers have alluded to, that is not usually the case, right? So these are the numbers before the intervention. And this has been replicated in different countries across the world in different disciplines like social psychology, sociology, showing that actually non-religious individuals perceive less compatibility between religion and science. This is the first time they've shown it for religion and evolution specifically, but they perceive less compatibility than other areas. And there's all sorts of interesting sociological research coming out that's illuminating the consequences of some of this. So for instance, there's a study showing that non-religious graduate students actually promote conflict between religion and science as a way to promote their social bonding, right? It helps them fit in with each other more, which is great for making us non-religious individuals feel like we fit in, but maybe not so great for science and society as a whole if we're trying to include religious individuals. My prior work had showed that non-religious biology faculty are propagating conflict narratives in their classroom. And then thinking a step beyond that, what we know from some work that I'm doing now is that students are going to leave our classrooms and they're going to talk to other people about what they learned, their friends and their family, the people that trust them, right? So by increasing perceived compatibility among atheist students, we might actually improve their future cultural competence, thereby maybe reducing identity protective cognition about science in society broadly. So now, because of the fact that these practices work with non-religious and religious students, we no longer call it religious cultural competence, we call it conflict-reducing practices. All right, so I'm out of time, but what? We now call them conflict-reducing practices, right? Because it's not just about religious students anymore, right? And so our summary here is we're just showing that our studies that we've done are confirming the single studies that these practices work, that you can be openly non-religious and still be effective at implementing them. And moving forward now, we're trying to create a new framework for life sciences communication education because of all the work that I've done with professors, like seeing how they might be implementing conflict-inflating practices, I wanted to start creating a new framework in which we teach life sciences students conflict reduction communication. So this isn't just about evolution, right? It's about climate change, it's about vaccines. And so we're embarking on a 5-year multi-study. We're about a year into it where we're creating this new instructional framework. Hopefully we can propagate conflict reduction science communication in society. All right, and that's it. I will take any questions.